let's go to the next part. We'll talk about Kamala Harris and this interview that she gave on 60 Minutes. There is a lot to say here. I think we'll focus first on this. The answer about changing position. This is where it's funny because
she had a couple months to
even CNN, right? Even CNN and Dana Bash in the most like tongue-bathing interview possible by a national news host, she asked in the most tepid way possible, like, well, you know, some people say you change your positions, and you know, how do you square that? And you would think, you know, considering how awful that answer was, that you may change your tune. Well, turns out it hasn't changed all that much, and if anything, frankly, the answer has gotten worse. Let's take a listen.
You were for Medicare for all. Now you're not. So many that people don't truly know what you believe or what you stand for. And I know you've heard that.
In the last 4 years, I have been Vice President of the United States. And I have been traveling our country. And I have been listening to folks and seeking what is possible in terms of common ground. I believe in building consensus. We are a diverse people. Geographically, regionally, in terms of where we are in our backgrounds. And what the American people do want is that we have leaders who can build consensus, where we can figure out compromise and understand it's not a bad thing, as long as you don't compromise your values, to find common sense solutions. And that has been my approach.
That has been my approach. She basically said, well, I've traveled a lot and
heard from other people.
And look, I've even said this. Crystal disagrees with me. I'm curious what you think. I think at a certain point, you need to just own up and be like, look, I said a lot of things. It's clear the American people don't agree with me. I want to be president. I'm a consensus builder. But a lot of this is all like, oh, my values haven't changed. I'm about, but you never come out and actually just say it. So I'm curious what you think, Ryan.
The closest she ever got to that, I don't know if you saw this interview she did with Stephen Colbert, where he said...
That was also last night, yeah.
Well, this was a couple years ago.
Okay.
Like back in 2020 after she was named vice president. You know, he had her on and she said, well, you're now vice president. You basically called this guy a segregationist a couple months ago.
Yes, that's right.
And she laughed and she said, that was a debate.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I remember that. Yeah,
and
that's right.
the premise, the unspoken premise of that answer is, it was a game. I was point scoring. I was just trying to get ahead in a political contest. So that's what she has to try to get across to make your point without sounding like the most cynical person ever. But Tim Walz answered it the best when it was like, well, you used to be, you know, for assault weapons, now you're against them. How did that happen? Well, I sat with the victims of the Sandy Hook shooting. And
which means that changed another way of saying that is I had new information.
I had new information.
Okay.
So I think she could get away with a version of that answer if she said, look, I was running as a Democratic candidate for the nomination in 2020. That was before I was president, or I was vice president, and I've now seen, you know, the difficulty of governing, and so now I understand that some of that stuff, while it might be amazing and wonderful, we're just not going to be able to get it done.
Right.
But I'd still love to see it in a world where it was possible. But then she's stuck again because, well, that doesn't answer your immigration question. How'd you go from, because that is a world of possible. Right. That's executive orders, that's executive action. So, yeah, I mean, she got to look, I'm a politician, I just want to be president.
Yeah, and
we all know this.
Speaking of word salad, we saw this also on how are you going to avoid an all-out regional war? Let's take a listen.
The events of the past few weeks have pushed us to the brink, if not into, an all-out regional war in the Middle East. What can the U.S. do at this point to stop this from spinning out of control?
Well, let's start with October 7. 1,200 people were massacred. 250 hostages were taken, including Americans. Women were brutally raped. And as I said then, I maintain Israel has a right to defend itself. We would. And how it does so matters. Far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. This war has to end.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly? How are you going to, so remember the question, how are you going to avoid nuclear war? October 7th was really bad. Well, that wasn't the question that you were asked. You were asked about how you're going to prevent a nuclear war, and then eventually, oh, the war has to end. But when you say, and you lead with, but October 7th was so horrible, what are you saying? You're like, well, maybe I do support a little bit of a regional war. And there's an answer that we're going to get to in a little bit. It deserves its own block about who she thinks America's greatest adversary is, where maybe she does. Maybe she's just being authentic and honest. She's like, yeah, I think a war with Iran is a good thing.
She has this segment memorized very clearly. Like, we have heard her say this line of precise words so many times in the month that she's been running. Like, I can almost recite it at this point now.
Right.
Let's start with October 7th. 1,200 people massacred,
Right.
250 people taken hostage, including Americans, brutally raped. It's always, quote, brutally raped. And Israel has a right to defend itself. We would defend ourselves. I said it then, I'll say it again. And then she does her pivot, where her advisors are like, you have to now give something to the side of the people who think that this is horrific. And so then she says, but how it does so matters.
Yes.
And then she adds, far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. And then finally, another non sequitur, this war has to end. As if it's just going to end on its own, or Netanyahu's going to just decide to end it at some point. What's going on here, I think, is that the reason that Israel has no day after plan is that they have never had to have one. They've always just pushed as far as they possibly can, and then the Americans tug the leash and say, okay, Biden picks up the phone, Reagan picks up the phone, whoever, and says, it's over. This is done. You ceasefire, we're moving on. And so Israel's waiting for that to happen, and it's just not happening. So they're like, as long as you keep filling up our ammo dumps, we're going to keep unleashing them.
Right, and then just again on the, look, we'll just continue in this because I just think in every single one of these, it is so calibrated. And this isn't about me. This is about the fact that there is a lot of reams of polling data that's still the number one hang-up that people have about Kamala. They're like, yeah, I think you did better in the debate. But what do you really stand for? What are you going to do? Are you a shapeshifter? Are you a chameleon? There are actually a sizable part of the electorate believes that she is too liberal compared to Trump being, quote, too conservative. And on the issue of the border, that's perhaps no more where she is less out of step with the overall American public. So here she is now being pressed on a lot of immigration flip-flops by this administration. Let's take a listen.
You recently visited the southern border and embraced President Biden's recent crackdown on asylum seekers. And that crackdown produced an almost immediate and dramatic decrease in the number of border crossings. If that's the right answer now, why didn't your administration take those steps in 2021?
The first bill we proposed to Congress was to fix our broken immigration system, knowing that if you want to actually fix it, we need Congress to act. It was not taken up. Fast forward to a moment when a bipartisan group of members of the United States Senate, including one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, got together, came up with a border security bill. Well, guess what happened? Donald Trump got word that this bill was afoot and could be passed, and he wants to run on a problem instead of fixing a problem. So he told his buddies in Congress, kill the bill, don't let it move forward.
But I've been covering the border for years. And so I know this is not a problem that started with your administration.
Correct.
But there was an historic flood of undocumented immigrants coming across the border the first 3 years of your administration. As a matter of fact, arrivals quadrupled from the last year of President Trump. Was it a mistake to loosen the immigration policies as much as you did?
It's a long-standing problem. And solutions are at hand. And from day one, literally, we have been offering solutions.
What I was asking was it a mistake to kind of allow that flood to happen in the first place?
I think the policies that we have been proposing are about fixing a problem, not promoting a problem. Okay.
But the numbers did quadruple.
And the numbers
under your
today,
watch.
because of what we have done, we have cut the flow of illegal immigration by half.
But should you have done
cut
that?
the
Should you
flow
have
of
done that?
fentanyl by half, but we need Congress to be able to act to actually fix the problem.
See, I love that clip because anytime he talks about any executive action, it's a long-standing problem. Then anytime that there has been a reduction as a result of reverse of previous executive action, then you're taking credit for it. Well, which one is it? You know, what is the causal link between all of that? And again, what I come through with a lot of that, and look, I care a lot about the border issue and immigration, et cetera. So I am trying to take my hat off and look at this from the swing state voter, somebody who is looking at this issue and be like, hey, how are you thinking about this? I don't think there's a coherence to this. Now everyone will be like, oh, but Trump, there's no coherence. Now, actually though, if you look in the rambling and all of that, there is a pretty consistent through line about what Donald Trump thinks about immigration. You know, other issues I think you could fairly criticize, but on that, you know, and that one people care a lot about. I don't see that in this at all. It's just a complete muddle. And I actually think that's the through line of all three of these things that we just took a look at. It's like, what do you actually believe? What are you going to do? And in every single one, it was a flub.
And this one, she's just completely screwed by the trajectory of the Democratic Party over the last 5 years. There's probably been no issue on which they have swung this much. Because in the 2000s and 2010s, they were actually fairly tough on immigration. They torpedoed for political.
Rhetorically, they were.
But they also torpedoed for political reasons a comprehensive bill because they wanted to make Republicans out to be the party of nativists. Obama was dubbed the deporter-in-chief by immigration groups. Obama had kids in cages in 2014, 2015, and 2016. This was not an open border, humane immigration policy coming from Obama. Then Trump comes in with his nativist rhetoric and Stephen Miller and all these guys. And so Democrats then all of a sudden put up signs in every front yard across America that says, immigrants are welcome, and that that we're a nation of immigrants. And so they went from fairly moderate to pretty far to the left, historically speaking, for Democrats. And then the second that Biden gets into office, and you have Title 42, and you have the end of the kind of COVID era policies, and you have a surge at the border. When that becomes a political problem, they swing way to the right. So you're asking any politician to defend that whiplash from center to left to right is going to be impossible when you have kind of executive action at your fingertips that not only can you take, but you did take. So if they had never swung to the right on immigration, she would have a much better answer for that question. We're consistently, we're pro-immigrant. We believe that we are a nation of immigrants and that immigrants strengthen our country. Democrats decided they're not going to be that party. And when they abandon it, Democrats as a voting bloc, as a public, also abandon it. And so now support for immigrants is at 20% or something.
So I don't know. I know this is a convenient leftist narrative, but I still think there's a reality issue. You have tens of millions more people who are here illegally under that administration. The reality people woke up, and this whole it's not about the philosophy of immigrant. It's like, well, what type to what system people want order, and the disorder of it is frankly what changed the status quo.
The real problem
far more than any change in position.
And maybe we agree with this. I don't know. The real problem here was the end of the guest worker program.
I don't agree with that. But anyway, continue.
We don't have enough American workers, especially to do all the rebuilding that's going to be necessary in Tennessee and North Carolina and Florida. In the 80s, we ended our guest worker programs. We had this idea that everyone in the world just wants to live here, and that they don't actually want to live in Mexico or El Salvador or Nicaragua or wherever they're from. But in fact, their actual preference is if they could come here for 4 or 5 months, make enough money to send back to their family, and then go home to their families and live where they're from. That's actually their preference. A well-regulated guest worker program where people are protected, given labor protections, treated fairly, but able to come and go creates a much more rational system in a world where you have this much inequality between two different countries. When you build a wall and you say you can no longer go back home, then they send for their families.
Well,
and then you get what we've got.
But Ryan, presumptive in all of this is a very, very low wage, and that's part of the issue. Look, we can't get into this debate because we got our election forecaster.
You like housing
Logan
prices being affordable, right?
Yes, I do. I also want people to be able to get paid who are American citizens.
What's a good wage if you're in El Salvador?
I don't care about El Salvador. El Salvador's problems and wages are its own problems. And by the way, they fixed a lot of those problems by locking up every single one of their gang members, but that's a separate issue. Like I said, our election forecaster's here. Otherwise, we would go at it for the next 30 minutes. Logan Phillips, let's get him in here.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show, ad-free, and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.